Welcome everyone to another AIOH webinar series. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Your home screen should look something like this with the presentations appearing on the left and some interactive elements on the right. Feel free to customize them using the diagonal arrow on screen. During the webinar, please chat with other attendees or submit a question for the presenter using the chat tab. If we run any live polls, a pop-up will appear in the polls section and you'll be able to participate and submit your answers. If the presenters have made available any handouts or notes, you'd be able to download them under the Handouts tab anytime during the webinar. If for some reason you are unable to complete the webinar or have to leave halfway, we will send through a full recording of the session post the event. For now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the webinar, which will begin shortly.
My name is Kelly Johnston, and it's my pleasure to be the chair of today's presentation and also to introduce our presenter, Mr. Brad Prezant. So Brad is an evidence-based public health scientist, occupational epidemiologist, and occupational hygienist. The majority of his career has been spent as a consultant in private practice. His university experience includes full-time employment and faculty status at several universities, including the University of Washington in Seattle, the USA, and Massey University, Wellington in New Zealand, where he initiated as well as contributed to occupational health research. Mr. Prezant holds master's degrees in public health and business administration, both from the University of Washington, Seattle. Mr. Prezant is certified by the American Board of Industrial Hygiene as a certified industrial hygienist in comprehensive practice and the subspecialty of indoor air quality, as well as the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists as a certified occupational hygienist. The title for Brad's presentation today is Managing Ventilation and Infection Risk from SARS-CoV-2 in Public Buildings, the Path to Reopening. Obviously a very current and important topic, particularly in Victoria. So I will hand over now to Brad to take us through his presentation. Thanks, Brad.
Hello, everyone. I assume you could see my screen. I am going to start my PowerPoint here, and hopefully that will work. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So the title of my talk is Managing Ventilation and Infection Risk from SARS-CoV-2 in Public Buildings. And it's really all about the path to reopening. So the things I'm going to talk about today are first, why we as occupational hygienists are relevant to the discussion. The problem of building occupancy in times of COVID. I'm going to talk a bit about the guidance that we've received from public health authorities and some of the issues that have resulted from the imprecision and contradictory nature of that. I'm going to talk briefly, and I'll explain why briefly, about the evidence surrounding airborne transmission. Managing perceptions, risk scientists, and the public, which is an important piece of this. Some of the factors governing indoor airborne transmission, and the solutions, which involve looking at not only the quantitative aspects, but also the communication aspects. And then I'll present to you the VA COVID infection risk manager that we've developed to assist in this process, and show you some other calculators that are out there for measuring infection risk. So I think it's really important because we have not been really included in this discussion, and I think we very much should be. As occupational hygienists, we bring a tremendous amount of value to this discussion. An awareness of the hierarchy of controls, the concept of risk minimization. We're used to dealing with hazards of all different natures and managing them appropriately. An appreciation of risk communication as an essential element here. Clearly an evidence-based approach consistent with medical and other approaches, public health approaches, and a tremendous amount of technical expertise in understanding exposure. Really classic things like source, path, receiver, understanding how airflows move through a building, understanding ventilation systems and indoor air quality. So all these tools, I believe, really could contribute tremendously to the discussion, but I don't think we've really been at the table. So we're all looking at a problem here as a community. Clearly, those of us in Melbourne have been, going through it a little tougher than some of the other folks throughout the country. But we have an issue that we're all going to, at some point, want to get back to the CBD and occupy buildings. And there's really a lack of clarity, not just in the public, but also from public health authorities in these issues of indoor exposure. If you look at what the WHO was saying, and this is back in March, fact, COVID-19 is not airborne. And this is the kind of guidance that we've been getting, all sorts of contradictory guidance from cognizant public health authorities, not just international, but also here within Australia. That's been very, very confusing, which reminds me of the Indian folk story of the blind men and the elephant. Not only do you have the public running around trying to figure out what's going on, but clearly we've got really the public health authorities running around and like the blind men feeling different pieces, trying to say which is the significant source of contagion. But what do we actually know about transmission of SARS-CoV-2? Well, we do know that as we pass air over the pharynx, the larynx, and the entire upper respiratory system, droplets of various sizes are ripped off. And very heterogeneous mix of different sizes, and all those droplets from respirable to larger droplets are carrying a certain amount of contagion. We talk about droplet and aerosol, I think is pretty much the language that we've been seeing, where droplet is the large stuff, perhaps the stuff that will fall out within 1 to 2 meters of an individual speaking, and the aerosol is the fine portion. We know that there is some exposure, although actually I think the evidence for the significance of fomite exposure, fomite meaning surfaces, somebody either sneezing or breathing or somehow transferring respiratory fluid to a surface, either through their hands or directly, us touching that surface and then touching our mucous membranes and getting an exposure in that manner. We really are unsure about what the evidence base is for that, but we've certainly spent a lot of time and money, addressing that issue in terms of either spraying or cleaning activities. And there hasn't been much discussion, but there's probably good reason to believe that there could be a fecal route of transmission as well. Every time you use the toilet, you create a pretty large aerosol of fecal material that's going to be floating around in the air and has the potential to move. This whole issue of near field droplet and far field aerosol has really been perhaps the most controversial one. And you can see here from one of the calculators I'll be talking about later, the user's manual, Alex Mazurski's graphic. The near field droplets, the large droplets that are expelled, just simply on a size basis are not going to travel that far. Due to gravitational force, they're going to settle out relatively close to the individual, 1 to 2 meters. But it's the small stuff that's going to be going to remain airborne for an extended period of time, and will move wherever the air currents are moving. This concept has been a very hard sell. It's really taken a number, and I'm only going to go through 1 or 2 here, but I chose this one because not only was it a very clear situation where 53 members of a chorus group of 61 in attendance were confirmed to have contracted COVID-19, and they had taken some pretty strong precautions against exposure via other routes. And you know, although this is circumstantial evidence, I think it's pretty clear that the aerosol route is a good explanation for this. You know, the authors of this paper, you know, really read like a who's who of aerosol physics. So there was a really large movement among the aerosol physicist community of people who are indoor air quality scientists who have been looking at this issue behind pushing the concept of aerosol transmission and getting it recognized. Interestingly, they do comment here in terms of the ventilation and the heating and the ventilation system. Do not shut the system off when people are using the room. Turning off the system will shut down outdoor air supply, which can lead to the spread of airborne infections. So clearly there is going to be a factor related to air changes per hour and improved ventilation on the droplets that are going to be remaining in the air for an extended period of time. And of course, that's all size dependent. The smaller droplets, we know, could have settling times of 30, 60 minutes. So we're talking about an extended period of time in which those things are going to be airborne. I just brought this one out. This was a flight that took place after the Ruby Princess passengers and other cruise ship passengers were discharged in Sydney, 19th of March. 8 passengers who developed COVID as a result of this flight probably were seated within 2 rows of infectious persons, but 3 were more distant, and 1 was seated 6 rows away. So again, circumstantial evidence, and there's probably at least 5 or 6 other ones that we could point to that support the concept of aerosol transmission. And the reason I said I would be brief is I didn't want to steal the show from Lisa Brosseau's presentation. Another short little advertisement here for the AIOH symposium coming up. She's going to, I assume, cover this in much, much greater detail. So I'm going to stop here and continue on. I think the key piece to remember when it comes to aerosol transmission is it has a tremendous influence on the what we call the R0, the reproduction number. In other words, how contagious a disease is. The R0 is defined as the average number of people who will contract the disease from an infected person. And early on in the pandemic, we were looking at estimates of 1 to 2, but this was without accounting for, I think, both factors of aerosol transmission and the fact that asymptomatic people are going to be transmitting. But asymptomatic people don't cough and sneeze a lot. So if asymptomatic people are transmitting, it's probably via an aerosol route. A recent paper looked at this and concluded there was evidence that the true R0 might be between 4.7 and 11.4, considering all the super spreading events that have occurred. So this is really a key piece of information that has enormous implications for how we manage and deal with stuff. And to me, what happened with the healthcare workers, 3,574 healthcare workers infected in this state, that's the consequence of failing to understand this aerosol transmission route and failing to have appropriate public health intervention measures to address this. I am not convinced that we at this point actually have reached that point where we're understanding and managing that. And this to me is, right up there with silica, whether it be the coal miners or the countertop manufacturers. This is right up there with an unbelievable public health failure, occupational health failure. All right, I'm going to change topics a bit here. I'm going to talk about this idea of risk communication. So far we've been talking as scientists and public health personnel, really, and talking about the risk of infection. But I'm going to start talking about risk communication because I think I'd like to talk about this because it's a key piece for how we reopen buildings and how we move ahead. And I'll bet a number of you are familiar with a guy named Peter Sandman, who is a risk scientist who coined this particular paradigm: risk is equal to hazard plus outrage. And what Sandman says is that experts focus on hazard and ignore outrage, which means that they overestimate the risk when the hazard is high and the outrage is low, and underestimate it when the hazard is low and the outrage is high. And the public focuses on outrage and ignores hazard, which means that they overestimate the risk when the outrage is high and the hazard is low, and underestimate it when the outrage is low and the hazard is high. This is pretty important because outrage is as real as hazard, as measurable as hazard, and as manageable as hazard. And frankly, I think if you operate in occupational health in any sphere, understanding this paradigm is part of our job. So I'm just gonna, you'll have a PDF of this talk, and I've listed the website here. You could download this book for free. It was originally published by the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and it's an absolutely fabulous resource and a really good read. It's a lot of fun to read and quick and easy. So Sandman goes through 12 questions to ask when we deal with this issue. And if you look at these, you can see that many of them, probably 6 or 8 of them, are very, very much applicable to SARS-CoV-2. Is it dreaded? Is it catastrophic? Is it knowable? Is it controlled by me? Is it natural? Is it voluntary or coerced? All of these issues really become relatively important. And when we talk about occupying buildings, it's just not going to work to tell people to go back in their buildings. They're just not going to do it. So if we want to get people to reoccupy buildings, we're going to have them do it voluntarily. Okay, so that was kind of my little preliminary on the risk communication, and now I've kind of changed the problem from my original definition. Building owners and occupants won't reoccupy buildings until they perceive to be unsafe for SARS-CoV-2. So we really need to deal not just with the scientific aspects of it, such that it is unsafe, but we need to deal with the perceptions. So that means we need to manage the airborne transmission and manage the risk communication aspects. So with that in mind, and having seen some of the scientific work and tracking that, which I've been doing for many years through my involvement with ISIAC, the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, I guess that's my second advertisement for the day. If you go to their website, there's a tremendous amount of resources on aerosol transmission of SARS-CoV-2. We developed a quantitative risk assessment tool to determine a room's risk of airborne infection that is intended to be the quantitative core of an existing risk management program. But it's also a risk communication tool. So the idea was to make this available to people in a way that it would follow through on Sandman's voluntary versus coerced concept. So what it is it's an easy to use web-based interface that runs on a number of different platforms and can be used by non-technical people. It's applicable to offices, schools, restaurants, a multi-building campus, a single warehouse, or workplace environment. So it's a very versatile tool, and it can also be used by experts. And it takes into account the factors that are governing indoor airborne transmission. What are they? Well, they have to do with the emission of viral material, which is going to tremendously vary from one person to another. But we do know that it's extremely closely related to speaking volume and duration. I've seen estimates that each 6 decibel increase in volume doubles the emission rate of the virus. And it's also determined by the ambient airborne concentration, which is going to be driven by the size of the room and the flow of air in and out, the number of air changes per hour, or the air exchange rate. And finally, it's going to be driven by the time of occupancy and what people are doing in that space. So the activity as it impacts inhalation rate. So for example, if you're in a yoga class and you're working hard, you're breathing a lot more material, you bring a lot more air and a lot more infective material. And then any type of technology that's intended to prevent exposure, such as air cleaners in the room or mask usage or anything like that. So those are the key factors that we needed to include in the model. The model works really by combining what we call a traditional box model, and this could be for a styrene leak in the middle of the room. It could be for any type of contaminant in the room. Basically, what we're assuming is that as the material, the source strength, as that material evaporates or is aerosolized, it will build up its steady state concentration over time. And after 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, based upon the air exchange rate, it will reach a steady state, and it will hold as long as the emission rate is the same. So this is what we call the traditional box model. So the tool combines this model to calculate the concentration in air with something called the Wells-Riley infection model to determine the risk of infection from the concentration in air. So the Wells-Riley goes back to 1978, and it goes back to a disease which we now know has tremendous aerosol transmission, kind of the classic in that regard, measles. And basically what the Wells-Riley model does is it predicts the probability of infection based upon this equation, based upon the number of people who are infected in the room, the quanta of airborne infection, and quanta is basically the amount of infective material that you would have to inhale in order for 63% of the exposed persons to become infected, the ventilation rate, the room ventilation rate, time. So you combine all of these, and it kind of works out to the bottom line here: 1 minus exponent of quanta inhaled per person. So the math's not terribly complicated, but that's what we're doing inside this model. We're combining the compartment model with the Wells-Riley, and then we're considering a number of building factors, activity factors, and SARS-CoV-2 factors in order to calculate the risk of infection. And those building factors include the room volume, the air exchange rate, the number and volumetric capacity of the portable air cleaners that may or may not be present, the number of occupants, duration of occupancy, and whether or not the infected person is speaking and how much of the time they're speaking and how loudly they're speaking. The use of face masks and their efficiency both on emission of viral material and inhalation of viral material. And then finally, certain things that have been established just in the last several months pertaining to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, the settling rate, which is really driven by what you assume the aerodynamic diameter of the respiratory fluid to be, and the inactivation rate of the virus in air, which is driven by things like relative humidity. There's a lot of concern right now in North America that as a result of winter coming and decrease in relative humidity, that's going to create additional potential for exposure due to a reduction in the inactivation rate. And finally, the Wells-Riley model in terms of the inhaled quanta necessary to cause infection. And what the calculator outputs is the risk of infection as a percent of persons exposed, or of a likelihood percent, and then the number of cases. So you can think of the first one as my individual risk, and you can think of the second one as the number of cases as being the public health implications. That's going to be driven by the number of people who are present in the room. And the output is either as a numeric value or as a color code. All of the scientific assumptions built into the calculator from the open literature, and it's very much complementary to other calculators that are being used. You'll get the same numbers in terms of the results that are used by other sophisticated users. We are currently using the calculator to use an external benchmark in terms of the risk of infection, but you could also look at the internal calculator if you're comparing a number of different rooms in the same building. So that's more of a relative comparison as opposed to an absolute comparison. And we also have a mode in which we could look at a person entering multiple rooms in various buildings and summing the risk for each room. I think one of the strengths of this approach is that it could be used both by a non-technical person, and we've really simplified the output to green, yellow, or red, or it could be used by an expert user to permit them to see all the quantitative information and modify all the scientific assumptions for a given building or room.
We're all concerned about being indoors with others. Will I get infected? How can I, as an employer, provide a safe workplace? How high is the actual risk for a particular room, in a particular building? Is a mask enough for protection? The solution. A quantitative risk assessment tool that uses the size of the room, the airflow, the occupant activities, and what scientists know about SARS-CoV-2 virus, allowing people to safely reoccupy buildings in a timely manner during the COVID-19 pandemic. Using the latest algorithms, this tool is powerful enough to provide a scientific estimate of the risk of infection. Simple enough to be placed in the hands of a building occupant to allow them to understand and manage their risk, reduce their anxiety, and provide the confidence needed to reoccupy their building. In short, this is a risk assessment tool, but also, and most importantly, it's a risk communication and management solution. A user begins by choosing the number of occupants and the duration spent in the selected building, and immediately sees the risk of infection for all the rooms in descending order, with the room with the least risk on top. As the number of persons increases, and the time increases, the risk increases, and the changes are shown in real time. The easy-to-interpret colored scale bars move from green to yellow to red to indicate the risk. Are masks being used? Toggle the switch to see how this parameter affects the risk level, allowing you and your team to assess and mitigate risk prior to using a space. Advanced users, when granted access by the building definer, have the ability to modify the underlying assumptions used to calculate the risk. Are air cleaners present? How many and at what capacity? Advanced users can display the calculation fields showing the exact numbers used to calculate the results. Changing the default values to reflect any unique aspects of the occupancy makes the tool useful to even the most advanced health scientists. When defining the building and its rooms, the volume and inward airflow, when known, are entered. Default values for airflow are used when none is specified. After all the rooms are entered, the building definer chooses the bounds for the colored bands, based on internal policies or on external guidance from public health authorities. These can be changed at any future time, based on changing guidance. All the building data is stored for future analysis. This flexible web tool operates smoothly on all platforms, so whether you're accessing from your office, your tablet, or from your phone on the go, the data you need will always be at your fingertips. The VA COVID Calculator is a risk management solution forming the core to your return to workplace strategy. By working with a program that runs on personal devices in real time, building occupants can return to their buildings with confidence in their safety.
So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and change screens here and show you exactly how the calculator works. I think that should be working. Yeah. Okay. So what I've done is I've started an analysis of this particular building. And because I've been here previously, it's recognizing the last building that I work with, basically. I'll show you in a minute how I would change that. But I would say, all right, we're going to have a meeting with 8 persons, and it's going to go for 2.5 hours or so. For the moment, we'll leave the masks off. Starting the analysis, and what I see on the left-hand side is a descending order with just color bars of green, yellow, red pertaining to the risk of infection, number of cases that would be arising. And there's no numbers here at this point. This would be the simplest use mode for someone who's non-technical. In addition to the risk, we've got the time to reoccupancy, which is basically the time that it would take for whatever might be floating around in the air based upon the air changes in that room to decrease to 1% of its previous value. So let's say you had a morning meeting in 4D and you wanted to take a lunch break and then reoccupy afterwards, you would want to make sure you waited at least 46 minutes. And then as you go down, based upon the individual room characteristics, you're going to see that the ones that have higher risk of infection are turning red. In the advanced mode, we are looking at two possibilities here. The case in which a speaker is infected and other occupants are susceptible, or the case in which an occupant is infected. And of course, the big difference here is in the emission of viral material, because the person speaking is far more infectious while they're speaking, and depending upon how loudly they're speaking, than someone who's just sitting there breathing. The advanced mode also allows us to change based upon what might be a reasonable assumption about what's going on in the way of speaking. So if you're in a bar and everyone is talking loudly, you would want to somehow capture that. And as you saw in the video, you could add in air cleaners here if that's appropriate and relevant, and watch how that modifies the risk. The advanced assumptions pretty much allow a knowledgeable person to go in and modify all of the underlying factors that are driving the calculations. So I'm going to show you now how we do the building entry. But if a flow in liters per second into the space isn't defined, the system defaults to 2.4 air changes per hour. This particular courthouse with all these courtrooms, I input from the building management system. I went into the BMS and pulled what was a typical heating flow, about 15 or 20% of maximum air conditioning flow, and put those values in for each of the room based upon what I was seeing from the BMS and the terminal box values. Because I entered something in each field, this is not going to do anything because there's a number in every field for liters per second into each room. But if I wanted to look at a wholesale modification of the room and implement some massive air change thing for the entire building, then I could override the values that were entered previously. As I had mentioned earlier, one of the main factors governing quanta emission is the speaking volume. So perhaps if you had an opera singer, you'd be up around here. And if you were just sitting and talking very, very softly or whispering, you might be down there. And you can, again, adjust all these different values: the quanta emission rate, the breathing rate, the decay rate, the deposition to surfaces. And we've assumed the mask efficiency. When the mask efficiency is toggled on, we've assumed an efficiency of 50% for a mixture of medical surgical masks and homemade masks, cloth masks, and an efficiency of intake of 30%. But if you are looking at an N95 situation, you're going to see something much closer to this. So that's basically how the model works, at least this mode of it. When you're defining a building, you basically are going to be adding rooms. So a building has been defined. I'll start with a new building. So if I entered this example building and I then started typing an address, it's going to come up with a list that I would choose. Here, and then I would start adding rooms. So I might add my living room here, specify the volume, specify the airflow rate if appropriate, and then keep adding rooms until I've added as many rooms as is necessary. And then all the buildings that I own that I've defined are going to be listed here on the side. So there was a pretty interesting situation. If you look at the white paper, you will see that there's an example of this Big Moose Inn and Tri-Town Baptist Church in Millinocket, Maine, and the infection that occurred there. I am now going to show you a different mode, which is what we call a plan your activities mode. So what we've been doing is this analysis of a particular building. And when we started running this past a number of possible users, including airports and other shopping centers, stuff like that, it became clear that comparing one room to another was not necessarily the most useful way to use the model, the calculator, but in fact, people would move from one space to another, like moving from the airport in your departure city to the airport in your destination city, where you might have different activities. So if I selected a particular building for this activity, and this activity was wait to check in, and I had a particular location in there, and I knew that there were this many people waiting, and it was going to take me this long to check in. No face masks. I would enable or disable whatever factors are appropriate, and then choose the room. Then I would add another activity. I'll call this activity 2, or maybe go to restaurant. And I'll choose a room, which is the restaurant, and the number of people, and I'll be there for an hour. We'll choose that room. I might add another one, which is wait in the waiting area of the gate. Find the appropriate place, add the number of people who might be present. And then I could look at the entire sequence of activities in room, quote unquote, rooms that I passed through. So I defined 3 activities. A total of 23 persons were encountered. It took 2.5 hours. And each of these wait to check in had a risk of infection associated with it. This was 6.52. This was 1.96. Waiting in the waiting area of the gate seems to be the major contributor. So either in the speaker infected or the occupant scenario, it looks like this is the one factor that perhaps I might want to do some intervention on. This is the one that results in the greatest risk. And here's just a summary of each of the 3. So that would be the I guess you would call it activity mode of using the calculator. So there are a number of other calculators out there, and let's see if I could switch back and share a different window. I think that's working. So here are 3 of the other calculators that are out there. I'll show them pretty quickly to you so you can get a sense of what they're like. One of them came out from Jose Jimenez and Shelley Miller at the University of Colorado. Another one came out of Lydia Morawska's collaboration with Giorgio Bonanno in Italy and Alex Mazuski. It's called the Airborne Risk Infection Calculator. And then a third one is by the National Institute of Science and Technology, and it's called Fatima. NIST is a federal government organization in the U.S. So this is the calculator from the University of Colorado. It's an Excel-based calculator. This will do the exact same thing that our calculator does. So if you were to go to the, first of all, there's a README section which explains the whole thing and the various calculations that are in there. If you go to a classroom model, you could enter the volume of a space, you could enter the number of persons, the duration of time, the ventilation with outside air. If you want to know how we do our calculations, this is how we do all the calculations in our model. So if you look at the calculation fields here, you can see, for example, the quanta calculation field. You can see each of the way that the numbers are manipulated. And then finally, based upon the average quanta concentration in the air, just applying the probability of infection is 1 minus exponent of the, in this case, B33, the quanta inhaled per student. So this is the Wells-Riley portion of the model, and the other portion of the model to calculate the quanta is the compartment model. So our calculator does exactly what this does. It's just that it's intended to be used by less sophisticated users, but it's going to give you the same answers. Here is the, well, that's the explanatory thing for ARC. Let's see, I have to bring a different screen up to show you the ARC calculator itself. I don't know if that's working. Let's see. We'll try that again. There we go. It's happy now. I think you can see that now. This is a similar calculator where you add in the different fields, and this one has a lot of extra capability in that it gives you a matrix of output, and it also outputs in various graphical functions. It's capturing the fact that you're going to see a vast difference as you change the ventilation rate. So it's got a lot of enrichment, let's put it that way, for someone who is technically minded and technically knowledgeable. And this is the Fatima model from the National Institute of Science and Technology, which I think must have come about as a result of Homeland Security, because you can change all sorts of factors here. You could change the density of the particle, the half-life, the mean diameter of the particle, the decay rate. So this has a tremendous amount of capability, but it's pretty tough to access. If you want to access it, you actually have an output file that you have to download and look. So none of these models allow you to compare one room to another, and none of them allow you to sum the risk for many different experiences in the way that I've described. I am going to go back here and share my screen again in a different one. Let's see if that's working. I think that's working. You all see that? Okay, great. So those are the three I talked about. I just pulled this off of Jose Jimenez's website. The feedback we're getting is that scientists are able to quickly understand the estimator, but persons who have a limited background really have a difficult time to it. So basically, the way that we see our calculator being used in its simplest mode is that someone like one of us, or one of you, would actually assist in verifying the assumptions that are built into the calculator make sense, define a building based upon its dimensions and air change. Hopefully, if you were able to go in and look in great detail to see what's actually happening in the room, or you could infer what's going on in terms of air change, you could enter a value into the liter per second field. If not, you could make an intelligent assumption about the air changes per hour that are going on, and then pretty much handhold and guide someone through the use of the calculator. But then, because it could run on a phone, and because it could run on an iPad or a laptop or anything like that, users should be able to approach a building, pull it up, say, I'm going to have a meeting with a certain number of people. What do I need to convince myself that this is going to be a safe situation? So that's the risk communication and the risk management piece of it, is that it's usable even in its simplest green, yellow, red mode. So the problem, building owners and occupants won't reoccupy buildings they believe to be unsafe and perceive to be unsafe. And the solution really is based on evidence-based principles here. And I think this is, far superior to what we have now, which is these guidelines that may actually either underestimate or overestimate the risk. So I noticed when we had the window here in Melbourne, when we could
very quickly. Are you meaning to share your PowerPoint slides with us at the moment?
Yeah, I think the slide, is it not sharing currently?
No, you're not sharing your PowerPoint slide at the moment. You might need to swap screens.
Ah, okay. I guess I screwed something up here. I'm sharing the wrong screen. Okay. I'm actually pretty much finished. Now it's working?
Yes, now we're seeing your slides. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Well, my previous slide was just a discussion of the practicality, but bottom line is by using these scientific principles, I think that this makes a lot more sense than talking about something like 20 persons per restaurant when you have no idea of the size of the room, the air change per hour. That could be vastly underestimating or vastly overestimating the actual risk that's present. And it is not in any way, shape, or form an evidence-based approach. So I think that this approach makes a lot more sense for us in reopening and moving through this period of time. So I am going to end my slideshow at this point. And I guess at this point we could do some questions.
I think, Brad, we got some time, so we might run your little polls. We'll see how well everyone was listening. We'll do a quick quiz of the audience.
Okay, that sounds good.
We've got our first question for the poll, and it's, which transmission mechanism is responsible for most public transmission for SARS-CoV-2? And we've got our answers coming in.
Ah, okay, great. Well, that's pretty exciting to see it coming up in real time here.
It's exciting, isn't it?
I thought when it said 3 answers that we'd lost everyone. I was so boring that everyone kind of tuned away, but I guess it's accumulating.
Yeah. They might be having a think about it.
I think we're pretty close to the peak. Huh? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think airborne's just
Close enough. You know, my answer to this question was D, insufficient information to determine. So I think there's a lot of strong evidence to show that airborne transmission is occurring, and it may be responsible for many of the mystery cases. But I think there's also really good evidence showing that when people bring contagion home, that they infect the people in their immediate surroundings, their families. So that's probably mostly close contact. It may be fomite. It's just really unclear at this point. But I think the theme and the moral of the story here is that from a precautionary perspective approach, you kind of want to focus on all of these. And in particular, you don't want to exclude the airborne route. That needs to be managed as carefully as we've been managing the fomite route, for which there's little evidence, but who knows? We'll see. We'll see. All right, let's do the next one.
Yeah, so our next question, when did the evidence for airborne transmission first emerge in a manner accepted by knowledgeable scientists in the area?
This is fun.
It is fun, isn't it? Oh, it's close run.
That's pretty almost evenly divided, right?
Yeah.
Not quite evenly, but plenty of answers in each category. That's great. Everyone's anonymous, right?
Yeah, that's right. Okay, well, it looks like
I think we're about there. The correct answer is C. I remember sitting in a room at an ISIAC conference, either Healthy Buildings or Indoor Air, in 2003, and listening to Hugo Lee present the evidence for SARS-CoV-1 transmission in the Amoy Towers housing complex. And it was really amazing to me. I was stunned at the fact that the evidence was really strong, showing that there was long-range transmission of aerosols. And there was just this unbelievable resistance among the medical community to accept that there could be airborne transmission. And that just, went on. I mean, there was less and less resistance as they did more and more research showing that this is what was going on with SARS-CoV-1 and computational fluid dynamic modeling and this and that. The evidence was really strong, but nobody wanted to believe it. So if you talk to, Hugo Lee or Lindsay Marr or Don Miller or Lydia Morawska or any of these aerosol scientists who've been looking at this issue for 20 years, this evidence has been incontrovertible. And it wasn't until Professor Morawska wrote her letter to the WHO, signed by 230 or 250 other scientists to WHO, that they actually grudgingly were willing to consider this as a possibility. So this is not new information.
No.
All right, should we run the last one?
Yep. So it's our last question. Which of the following factors has the greatest impact on infective dose? Air exchange, settling rate, speaking volume, deactivation rate. First option's looking like it's the most popular.
When you play with the model, which I've done a bit, it turns out that if you're doing like a sensitivity analysis and you change it in real time and watch what happens, speaking volume is actually the most important one. So the emission of quanta based upon speaking volume has the greatest effect on the risks. So the correct answer is C. Air exchange is important, but the difference in quanta emissions, a person at rest, according to Professor Morawska's research, is emitting 16 quanta per hour. A person speaking loudly, like a person standing up in front of a class, a professor, is emitting 135 quanta per hour. And it could be 500 or 600 for an opera singer or something like that. So that actually has the greatest impact from a sensitivity analysis. I'm going to take a look at some of the questions that came through. One of them was that most modern buildings have ventilation on demand, or I would call it variable air volume, VAV type systems that will differ constantly. How do you cater for this? So right now, the only way to cater for that is to go into the model and change the volumetric flow in a room. But what I would love to see long-term is integrating this product with the BMS, the Stafa, the Honeywell, whatever the control system is, where that is being pulled from the BMS, which is online, and it's possible to do that. That would be the ideal way to do it, so that we would actually know what the air changes per hour are, as opposed to inferring it on a seasonal basis or weekly basis or whatever it might be. The way that we're kind of commercializing this product, because we've invested a tremendous amount of time. I didn't do any of the programming. We have really good IT people to do that stuff. I have absolutely no idea, but I'm told that we've written over 20,000 lines of code to do this, and that the calculation piece is tiny, and it's all about the display piece on iPhones versus this and this. It's all about making this work for people. It's not about the calculations. But what we're doing is we're partnering with Deloitte, and we're looking at some type of a worldwide turnout for the product. We would love to get it into universities here. We're talking with airports, we're talking with schools, we're talking with legal systems and courthouses and the like. And mostly we're talking with consultants all over the world who might want to implement this as a partner with us for their clients. So if this is something that you'd like to get involved with, the website that I guess I could share my screen one more time. The website that you may have seen here, which basically is a recapitulation of a lot of the things that we've been talking about. You can download the white paper here, and it explains exactly what's going on. It has the video that you just saw, and then there's this section, request a demo. If you just fill this out, or if you just email me, or whatever is easiest, or text me, if you're interested in partnering with us, that's how we're planning on marketing it and using it. So we're expecting that this is something that could be implemented by knowledgeable occupational hygienists.
Okay, well, Brad, I think we've got 1 minute left. So is there any other questions in the list there that you could answer for us?
Does the use of air purifiers have a significant impact? It does, but not as dramatic as speaking volume, but yes, it does. Let's see, what are some others there? I guess a lot of people are having trouble with the handouts. Worst comes to worst, just email me. My email is b.present. If you could figure out how to spell my last name, you got it. At vasciences, with an S at the end of it, .org. So if you're having problems with the handouts, you can just email me. One of the questions, does fomite risk fit into calculation? The answer is no. This is limited to do aerosol assessments only, so that it would be the aerosol piece of a risk management program that included management of fomites and management of droplet transmission. Is directionality adjustment possible, or does it assume omnidirectional emissions? Clearly, that's a limitation of this model. It's assuming, even though reality is that the immediate area close to a person is going to have a higher level of virus particulate, respiratory particulate with virus in it. The model assumes steady state mixing and assumes that the concentration of virus is uniform throughout the entire space. So that assumption is much more valid in a smaller room and much less valid if the room turns into a giant room, because it would take a long time for a released contaminant to reach steady state throughout an entire enormous room. So that's certainly something to think about as one of the limitations of the model. I think I showed the AIRC user's manual at one point. It passed over the screen. If you go to the website at Lydia Borowska's QUT, there's a Airborne Infection Risk Calculator User's Manual, and they talk a lot about the limitations of the model. So I think that's all the time we have, right? Are we in time here?
Yes, I think we are, Brad, but I also think there was an issue with one of the handouts, the handout which was your PowerPoint slides, but Sam has tried to reload it a few times and I was able to just download it before. So if we just talk for another couple of seconds while people try to download that, it should be working now.
Okay.
As you say.
All right. Well, I'll answer another question having to do with UV light germination.
Right.
Yes, just like you model, the way that the common metric for modeling the degradation of the virus is in the units of air changes per hour, and they're kind of like minus air changes per hour. Basically, when we model the use of air cleaners, we're introducing a term that's converted to a minus air change per hour. So we have the air changes per hour that are going on from the ventilation system, and we simply sum them. I could actually very quickly share my screen again and show you how that's done using the model from the University of Colorado, which I assume you could see. Yeah. So the ventilation with outside air here, you simply add in all of these terms because they're all in air changes per hour. The decay rate of the virus, deposition to surfaces, And in this case, UV disinfection, personal HEPA air cleaners, we don't have a toggle switch for UVGI, but the effective rate at which it was cleaning the air would be added in here. And then you would add to the total first order loss rate. And this number here, B22, is used in the calculation of the average quanta right here and here. So you could see that the loss rate is an important factor in this entire calculation rate. Make sense?
Sort of. I would have to look at it a lot.
It's actually very simple to incorporate UVC. It would be very easy to do that. So a couple of people talked about CFD modeling, computational fluid dynamic modeling. That's fabulous and will give a more precise estimate than this will. The only problem is that it's very difficult to implement, time-consuming and expensive. So it's not something that's going to be a very good tool that you could roll out for many, many, many buildings or workplaces.
Okay, Brad, well, I think we better wrap it up because we're 4 minutes over now. But thank you very much for sharing your time with us this afternoon and going through a very interesting topic that is of use to us all in our profession and working life. So appreciate your time, and I'm sure people might have questions for you, but you've given us your email address, and we know how to get in contact with you if we want to talk further about the topic with you. So thank you for your time.
Great, and thank you, and also Samira and everyone at AIOH for putting this all together and teaching me how to use this system.
You did a great job. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Hopefully we'll see you all at the symposium.